And tonight we're going to be talking about where's Waldo. Of course, it's not this gentleman here that we know and love. The gentleman we're speaking about tonight is George Edward Waldo. Now, George was born in New York on April 25th, 1834. He was the son of Elbiggins and Elizabeth Wood Waldo. He received his formal education out east. He stood 6'1", which was rather large for those days, or tall for those days. He had brown hair and gray eyes. Now, there is no existing picture of George Edward Waldo that we know of. Maybe the family has one, but there's nothing. Am
I wrong?
Yeah, just let it there.
Okay.
But there is no picture of him that we know of. So, but really, we do have a picture of him. This is George E. Waldo. This is his nephew. This gentleman was born in Manitowoc, raised here, lived here his whole life, and people that knew him said he was the spitting image of his uncle, George Edward Waldo. When they saw this young man, they said, right away they were thinking, boy, that's George Waldo, because he looked. So we have an idea what George looked like in his early 20s, because he didn't get much past that. Next picture. This is a picture of William Williams Waldo. William came to Manitowoc around 1846, 1847. He was a merchant, a merchant of wealth. He was also justice of the peace and city judge. And we also may know this gentleman as, if you're familiar with the story of the flag of Company A, he's the one that found the flag at the Philadelphia Exposition in the 1870s and made arrangements for it to be brought back to Manitowoc, where it's currently on display at the Manitowoc County Historical Society. So we know him from a couple different things. Next photo. This is Dorothea Florinda Wood. While in Manitowoc, William married Dorothea. She was the daughter of Sylvester Wood. Next picture. This is a picture of Sylvester. Sylvester was an attorney in the city of Manitowoc and brother-in-law to William Waldo, the picture that we've seen, the second picture we've seen. In the late 1850s, William persuaded his brother, George Edward Waldo, to come to Manitowoc and read law in the law office of Sylvester Wood. Now, if you're not familiar with reading law, this is how you became an attorney. You made arrangements with a law firm, and you did the clerical, the mundane work. And in your spare time, you would take a logbook off the shelf, and you would sit there and read. You would read law until you became acquainted enough to go before a board of lawyers in your town. They would ask you questions about Wisconsin law, and if they felt you were knowledgeable enough, you became a member of the lawyers. And this is how George Edward Waldo became an attorney in the city of Manitowoc. By the time he was 23, I believe, he was an attorney working for the law firm of Sylvester Wood. Next picture. Here we have Charles Walker, and the reason we have him is while George Edward Waldo was living in Manitowoc, he was living in the house of Charles Walker. Now Charles was, he was a prominent lawyer also. He and a man named Lee had a law firm. During the Civil War, he became captain of Company K, 21st Wisconsin Volunteers. He was also, I believe, State Assembly, 18... Okay. Okay, State Assembly, 1856, 1857, and he was a county judge in Manitowoc, very prominent attorney. And like I said, while Waldo was here, he lived in the household of Mr. Walker here. Next picture. Picture of Horace Walker, brother of the party that we have just spoken about. He would become the captain of Company A of the 5th Wisconsin Manitowoc County Guards, and he would play a picture in this also. So the next picture up. This is a copy of the 1860 Manitowoc census. Okay, we do have some of the, if you look up, here's Charles Walker, here's George Waldo, who was living in the same household. Charles was listed as an attorney. He had assets of $6,000, which was fairly substantial in those days. I don't know if we got all of them on here. In addition, well, we should be right below here. Here's William Waldo. He's Justice of the Peace, and he was the merchant that we talked about, and he also had assets of $3,000. And I think down here is Sylvester. That's Sylvester Wood, the prominent attorney with assets of $10,000. He had maybe 4 attorneys working for him. The reason I put this up is because I've thrown a lot of names at you, and I was hoping that this would help a little bit. The one, Joseph Vilas, if you're familiar with him, probably the wealthiest man in Manitowoc. He had assets of around $30,000 and ran a big merchant store, which on A Street, right after the bridge, used to be Johnson Hills and a couple other places. He built that building. Most of these people lived on the north side of Manitowoc. These were considered the wealthy people of Manitowoc. The lawyers, the doctors, anybody with any money lived up on the hill on North 8th Street. That's why you see the names that we're looking at here, such as George Waldo. If he had lived long enough, he was only 25 at that time in 1860, he probably would have been a very wealthy too by the time he had advanced in age a little bit. By the beginning of 1860, the clouds of war were already gathering over the United States, and that included the city of Manitowoc. The word of the opening blow of the war came to Manitowoc on Saturday, April 19th, 1861. It was brought by the steamer Comet from one of the newspapers from Milwaukee. The following evening in the city of Manitowoc, they had the famous meeting where all the citizens got together and all the prominent people in the village got up and spoke about patriotism, how we had to do something to help put down this rebellion. And they went on and on and on speaking about what should be done until finally somebody got up and said, okay, that's enough talk. We need to do something about that. So they brought a piece of paper forward and said, okay, everybody that wants to become a member of a Civil War company, come on up and sign up. And they did. They were able to recruit like 50, 60 people to become part of the first company, which would become the Manitowoc County Guards or later Company A of the 5th Wisconsin. Now, more than likely, George Edward Waldo was at this meeting, but he did not step forward and sign up. He had other ideas. The following day, him and a fellow attorney by the name of Don Shove, a very good friend of his, they boarded a steamer down along the docks there, traveled to Milwaukee, where they immediately signed up for Company K of the 1st Wisconsin Volunteers 3-month organization. They were shortly issued their brand new gray uniforms. Next picture. Picture of the gray uniforms that they would have been issued. I think, somebody can correct me, but I think it was the first 8 regiments of Wisconsin soldiers were issued gray uniforms before the federal government finally stepped in and made them switch to blue. So they were issued their gray uniforms and their muskets and their accoutrements, and immediately they were sent off to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, for what they believed would be the opening and closing battle of the Civil War. They figured they could do away with the rebels in one big battle and the whole thing would be over with. Unfortunately for the 1st Wisconsin, the only engagement that they were involved in, and it was not Bull Run like many people think it was actually the Battle of Falling Waters, Maryland. Next picture. This is an actual picture of Falling Waters, Maryland, where the battle took in and around. At that battle, the 1st Wisconsin had 2 men killed and 4 men wounded. Not as spectacular in this battle. For the next 3 months, or for the next month or so, they continued to live around that area until their 3 months service was done. At that time, they were shipped back to Wisconsin, back to Madison, where they were mustered out of service with the hopes that they would re-enlist for the period of 3 years or the duration of the war. One of the I think I may have mentioned this before in one of my talks, but most of the 1st Wisconsin did re-enlist, but there was one complete company of men that did not re-enlist. Anybody remember when I brought that up? Anybody have an idea why they would not have re-enlisted? Okay, they were all students at the University of Wisconsin, and their term of service started within a couple days, so they did not re-enlist. Neither did Waldo and his friend Don Shove. They returned to Manitowoc and immediately began to recruit men for their own company. The ideas of raising 100 men that they could then take to war, and they would become the officers. By October, they had about 60 men recruited, and they were drilling in Northside Park. Next photo. This is our beloved Union Park, and this is where they were drilling. And some of you can see those things that we've done. Not to get off the subject, but all the really nice things that we've done there in the last couple of years to improve the beauty of the park. Waldo was elected captain of the company, and about the 1st of November 1861, they received word that they were going to be called up to active service. The problem was that they only had about 60 men. They needed 100 men to become a full company. And they were afraid that if they actually reported to whatever camp they were assigned to, they would be broken up and put with other companies that needed the additional men. Fortunately for Waldo and Stove, there was a man in Kewaunee County that had the same idea, and he had been recruiting for a few months, and he had about 30 men. So they got together and they formed one company. Waldo was elected captain. The gentleman from Kewaunee County was 1st lieutenant, and Don Shove, Waldo's friend, who became the 2nd lieutenant. They left Manitowoc on the steamer Comet on November 20th, 1861, with orders to report to Camp Wood. Okay, to report to Camp Wood in Fond du Lac for training. Just before leaving, the citizens of Manitowoc presented Captain George Edward Waldo with a very fine presentation sword and sash, scabbard, a beautiful sword that he would eventually carry into battle with him. When they arrived in Fond du Lac at Camp Wood, they were, okay, next photo. Okay, this is how they would have traveled on the steamer Comet from Manitowoc to Sheboygan, and then by train to Fond du Lac, where they would eventually spend the next 4 months in training. At Camp Wood, when they arrived there, they were given, next picture, they were given a Shelby tents to stay in. If you're not familiar with the Shelby tents, they stand 12 feet in height. Excuse me, Sibley, you're right. Okay. They stand 12 feet in height, they're 18 feet in diameter, and they can easily sleep 14 men. But they often crowded them with about 18 men. And they would put one wood stove in there in the center of the tent, and the men would lay down with their feet facing the stove. They would be in a circle, their feet would be facing the stove, and their heads away. They were all issued a straw mat and a blanket. And like I say, they were expected to sleep this way, but once the snows of winter started accumulating, because this is already November, they were issued additional blankets to help keep them warm. On December 8th, the men were issued their new blue uniforms, their muskets, and their accoutrements, and they were called out to take the oath of allegiance to the federal government, which they all did. But by this time, some of the men had been experiencing army life and were not real fond of it. Imagine that. I mean, sleeping on the cold ground, and now there's snow on the ground. So they weren't all excited about this, but they had taken the oath of office. So one young man from Manitowoc, a young man named Zachariah Furdin, had an idea of how to get out of service. He figured that if he no longer had a trigger finger, he couldn't pull the trigger on the musket. So his friends knew that he was not real happy with being in the army life. So one day he told them he was going to go out into the woods and gather some wood for a fire. And he took an axe and he went out there and found a nice stump, put his finger down and came down on the finger. He looked at his finger and realized he had only cut it off to the first joint. And he figured, well, I can still pull the trigger on the musket. So he put it back down again, brought the axe down a second time, and now he looked, oh, that should do it, he figured. So he wrapped it up in his hanky and went back to camp. Well, like I said, the guys knew that he was not happy with service. So they followed his trail in the snow and his blood trail back to it. And of course, what did they find? But not one, but two pieces of finger. So they knew immediately what he had done. Ironically, he got his wish. He was quickly court-martialed and drummed out of service and sent back to Manitowoc. So he, in the long run, he did win. It's now March 8th, 1862. This company had now been designated as Company E of the 14th Wisconsin Volunteers. And on March 8th, they received orders from General Grant to proceed to St. Louis, Missouri, to become part of the active army. Next photo. So they went by train from Fond du Lac down to Chicago. Next picture. And from Chicago, they made their way to the Mississippi River. And I'm not exactly sure how in Chicago, I assume there's got to be some kind of a river channel or something that would take you to the Mississippi. And then down to the Tennessee River, where they finally arrived at St. Louis. Next photo. They reported to Camp Benton in St. Louis, and they were officially part of General Grant's 150,000-man Union Army. They would remain there. Next photo. I think that's going to be okay. On March 23rd, 1862, they were ordered on boats and with the intent of going to Pittsburgh Landing, or as we call it, Shiloh. But because they had reported to Missouri, they were one of the later regiments, they were one of the later ones to leave St. Louis. And by the time they got down to Savannah, Tennessee, most of the army had already gone to Pittsburgh Landing and were camped there, and there was no more room for them. So they were loaded at Savannah, Tennessee, and they would remain there for the next 10 days. Next photo. Okay, they would remain there for the next 10 days, knowing that there was something was going to happen downriver. And finally, 10 days later, on April 6, 1862, they heard guns off in the distance, cannons firing, and they knew that something major had started. Unfortunately, they're in Savannah, Tennessee, and they have no transportation to get to the battle. So they had to wait until about 4 p.m. that afternoon when boats finally arrived. They were loaded on and sent down to Pittsburgh Landing, where they offloaded about midnight. As they offloaded, they were given instructions where to join the Union line of battle. They began their march, and as they began, there was a massive thunderstorm that came through, and they marched that night by the lightning strikes that were in the sky. And as they marched, they passed the hundreds upon hundreds of dead Union and Confederate soldiers that had died the previous day in battle. By about 7 a.m. that morning, they had reached their destination where they were put into the line of battle, which would have looked very much like this. The battle on the second day started with the Confederates hoping to regain the pressure that they had put on the Union forces the day before. So the Confederates attacked first, but were quickly driven back by Union forces because they had now been reinforced by 25,000 troops that had come from Savannah. This is how the morning was spent, in a deadly seesaw of attacks and counterattacks. It was in one of these attacks that is Captain George Edward Waldo was leading his men, sword high in hand. He was hit in the chest, a massive blow to the chest, just above the heart. It's not known if he was hit by Confederate musket fire or shot from a Confederate cannon. He immediately went down to his knees. His friend Don Shove, who had been with him all this time, ran to his side, laid him down, and he was still conscious at this time and speaking. It so happened that just at this very instant, Confederates counterattacked. So Stove gathered 4 men from the regiment, the 14th Regiment. They picked up Waldo, carried him back to the Union lines, put him on a stretcher, and immediately began the journey to their field hospital. Now, it was during this walk to the field hospital that George Edward passed away. By the time he reached the aid station, he was gone. They put him with the dead, and because this turns out to be a Union victory of sorts, the Confederates were leaving the battlefield and the Union had possession of it, the Union was able to start burying their dead. So Captain Waldo was buried on the field. Next photo. Go one more yet. In a cemetery such as this, quickly or hastily made on a battlefield, he was buried there that same day. But he didn't remain there long. His friend Don Shove had his body exhumed, put it on a transport, and taken to Savannah for burial in the military cemetery at that location. Next photo. There he was buried with full military honors, and he was laid to rest in the military cemetery there. Next photo. Governor Harvey. We all know that from history that Governor Harvey intended to go down there. He took supplies with him, medical supplies for the wounded, food or whatever else he could gather for the soldiers. He was going to go down there and give aid to the Wisconsin troops. What's little known is that in addition to this, he took somebody from the Treasury with the intent of bringing back the bodies of the officers from Wisconsin regiments back to Wisconsin for burial in Wisconsin. Of course, as history records, Governor Harvey was on the Tennessee River, I believe it was, crossing from one barge to another when he slipped, went into the river, and immediately drowned, taking his money with him. His body was not recovered for like 10, 12 days later down river. So that put an end to Waldo's body coming home with the governor, like it would have. When word of Captain Waldo's death reached Manitowoc, it was already April 17th. Now, just 10 days past his death. He had been dead for 10 days. The news of his death came in one of the Milwaukee papers, which listed the casualties from Battle of Shiloh. Of course, Waldo was a very liked young man in this time. He was, people held him in high esteem. So they immediately raised $100 to send Reverend George Engel, the pastor from St. James Episcopal Church, down to Tennessee to recover the body of George Waldo, to bring him home for burial. So he went down there, And it took him a few days to find where Waldo was buried. He had the body exhumed again, and it was embalmed, and then he had him placed in, next photo, a metallic coffin. This is I wouldn't say a standard, but if you had the money at that time, you could be buried in a coffin made of metal. They were sealed, hermetically sealed around the edges. And up here they had a nice little viewing window where you could, if you cared to do so, you could look down on the face of the deceased. Next photo. Another style of one. Here you can see the viewing window is a little bit bigger in this one, but it's still open. You can see the clamps on the side, how they sealed these down. This was a used one. We don't know what happened to the body that was in here, but that would have been the viewing window in there. So he had his body placed in a metallic coffin. We know that from the newspaper articles from those dates, that he had the body put on a boat or a ferry boat and brought back to Manitowoc. The body arrived in Manitowoc about, I think it was Saturday, I gotta convert to my notes here again, April 27th, the body was finally back in Manitowoc. We're now 2 weeks since he passed away, so I don't know how many people looked in the little viewing window. But his body was taken to Masonic Temple, where it laid in state until the following day. It was then, next photo, put on a hearse, the standard hearse of those days, which would be hauled by probably 4 black horses, and taken to St. James Episcopal Church, where the Episcopal services was said, because he was a member of that particular church. The body was then placed back on the hearse and started the procession to Evergreen Cemetery. Now, it was said that there were 2,000 to 3,000 people in Manitowoc to witness this procession. This was the largest funeral in the history of Manitowoc up to that point. People, if you've been to the Memorial Day Parade in Manitowoc and you've seen all the people lining 8th Street all the way around to almost Evergreen Cemetery, that's what it would have looked like back then, with 2,000 or 3,000 people lining that route. And it was said that when the hearse reached Evergreen Cemetery, carriages from downtown Manitowoc were pulling into Evergreen Cemetery, but they were still leaving downtown Manitowoc. That's how long that procession was. Next picture. This is probably what the crowd would have looked like as they gathered around the burial plot in Evergreen Cemetery, waiting for services to begin. Words were said by the Episcopal priest, and the casket was lowered into the ground, and hopefully that's where Waldo was intended to stay. Within weeks, the family had placed a very nice stone over the grave. The stone read, Captain George Edward Waldo of the 14th Wisconsin Regiment, Company E, was killed April 7th, 1862 in the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee, age 27, 11 months, and 13 days. And that's how everything would remain for the next 18, 19 years. Every Memorial Day, citizens of Manitowoc, would come to the city and lay flowers on the graves of the Civil War veterans that had died during the Civil War. Those that had died since then, they placed flags and flowers and on the graves. And one of their favorite spots was that of George Waldo, because he was considered a town hero. He was the first Civil War soldier from Manitowoc to die in the war at that point. And the people of Manitowoc continued to hold him in very high esteem. It remained that way until sometime around 1876, 1877, 78, not yet, when someone noticed that his tombstone was missing. Of course, word spread that the stone was gone. They thought, well, maybe the family found something wrong with it. It was either cracked or it was coming apart or something. They'd had taken it off to have it reconditioned, and they figured eventually that the stone would be put back in place. Never happened. And basically, for the next 125 years, the grave went unmarked, except for, next photo. This is the wood Waldo monument that stands there today. That would have been there. There's 10 graves in the Waldo wood area. And, well, I'll get to that part later, but that's the family marker that stands there today. And that's where Waldo was buried, next to that. So that's the way it remained, with no marker on, for the next basically 125 years. That was until the Manitowoc County Civil War Roundtable stepped in. At that time, we were replacing the headstones of Civil War veterans that had become unreadable, that had broken, that had disappeared. And we were ordering these stones free of charge from the federal government under the Replacement Act, the Military Replacement Act, where we just ordered them and they would send them by freight to us, and then we would put them in remove the old one if they were still there and put the new one in place. One of those stones on our list was that for George Waldo. But unfortunately, because his original stone was gone, we didn't know which of the 10 graves that were in this plot he was buried in. So I made contact with the head of the cemetery there, the maintenance man, who agreed to meet me over there. And I told him I had a very nice metal detector, very good metal detector, that we figured should easily go down the 4 feet to where we could find this completely metal casket that he was buried in. I said there shouldn't be any doubt right away that we can find this thing in minutes. So we spent the next 15 minutes over the 4 graves, or 4 plots where no one was buried. The other 6 had headstones on. They were all recorded, so we knew he wasn't buried there. But the 4 that were empty, we figured, well, he's got to be in one of these 4. So we ran the detector over it. Not a thing. Not a thing showed, and it should have. So he told me, he said, well, wait here, I'm going to go back to the maintenance shed and I'm going to get some probing rods, or a probing rod. And he came back, and for the next half hour we spent sending these probing rods down 6-8 feet into the ground, hoping to hit that metal coffin. After about a half an hour, he looked at me and said, it's not here. It's gone. He says, it's not here. He says, I don't know if it's in the cemetery someplace or where it is. He said, but it's not here. So we had, the stone was coming, so we had to pick out one of the graves that, one of the graves where the stone could be placed. And within the month, the stone arrived, and about 6 or 7 of us from the round table showed up there, and we dug a hole 2 feet, or about 2.5 feet down, put footings down, put this heavy 4-foot granite stone in there, and buried it. Next photo. This is the stone that we put in back in the, I'm going to say back in the 1990s sometime, and that's still there today, marking Waldo where we hoped he was buried, anyways. And that's kind of the way that it would remain for, again, until I think it was 1993, and I was still on the police department at that time, and one of our many duties at that time was doing funeral processions. We would go to a funeral home, pick up a funeral procession going to one of the cemeteries, and then we would lead the procession to the cemetery. And we would do sometimes 3-4 of these a day. So we got to know the funeral directors fairly well. One of those was a gentleman by the name of Roy Pfeffer. And just in speaking with him, I was telling him about the Waldo thing, and that we were, curious of where's Waldo? We had put a stone in there. He became interested in that. And for the next couple of years, he did research on that. He spent a lot of time going through the cemetery records, going through newspapers, going through the records of the still existing funeral homes that were around at that time, and the courthouse records. And after about 2 years, he confronted me one day and he says, I can't find them. He says, the only thing I can find is the original April 1862 entry where he was brought here and buried. He says, I have no idea. But he spent enough time on this that the Herald Times actually did a feature story on him doing research on trying to locate Waldo. But again, after all was said and done, he says, I can't find him. Things remained that way. We were mystified as to what was going on there until last year, about this time. I was doing some family genealogy. I do a lot of genealogy, and I keep that on Ancestry. Keep all my family records on there. And I had some extra time, and I said, well, I'll do a search on Waldo. I had done this before, called his name up on there to see if anything showed up. And again, I punched in his information, and nothing came up. But this time, I saw a page for William Williams Waldo, his brother. So I clicked on that, it came up. And as I examined that, I saw he had a George E. Waldo. I said, well, that must be his son, the one that looked like Waldo. And then I realized, nope, he said, these are his children. So I looked over under siblings, brothers and sisters, and there was the name George Edward Waldo. So okay, so this should be interesting. I clicked on that, and it's a good thing I wasn't wearing dentures, because they would have been laying on the floor for what I saw next. Next picture. Here's the original headstone that was in Manitowoc in 1877. Exact same headstone. Sitting there so proudly, I said, well, okay, that's great. I said, but now where in the world is it? So I had to do some research on it, and I finally came to the conclusion that the stone, Waldo and his casket, are now located at Prattsburg Rural Cemetery, Prattsburg, Steuben County, New York. So, okay. He was one of 20 graves in the Waldo plot in Prattsburg Cemetery. After we discovered this, I talked to some of the people that were looking for Waldo over time, and we came to the conclusion of what happened was that Waldo had 3 brothers. One was living in Manitowoc, that was William Williams Waldo, 2 brothers living in New York. And we figured one day they came here, the 3 of them met with the Evergreen sexton, and under the table they paid him to some evening go in there, dig up Waldo's headstone and his body, put him in a crate, and turn it over to them, and they would then go down to the ferries in the morning or to the train station, because by this time Manitowoc had a train in 1877, put it on the train and take it back to New York for burial. During our research on Waldo, we had heard several times that the Waldo family was not very happy about Waldo being buried in Manitowoc. They felt that he should be buried in Prattsburg with his other relatives, which made sense, but there were no records. Apparently this was done under the table, and the sexton was paid enough to cover up the grave so that it looked like nothing had happened. Nobody thought anything about it until the headstone went missing, and they still believed that Waldo's casket was still in the ground there. And like I say, that remained that way for almost 150 years before we finally realized that Waldo was... So we know, like I say, the family kept this a secret. William Waldo continued to live in Manitowoc until his death in 1891. His body was then shipped to Prattsburg, New York for burial with the family. His wife, Dorothea Florinda Wald, passed away in 1917. She chose to be buried at the Waldo plot in Manitowoc simply because her parents were buried there and she already had a couple children that were buried there. So she stayed in Manitowoc and was buried. She is probably the last one in the city of Manitowoc that knew what happened to Waldo, and she passed away in 1917. So we know that George Edward Waldo died at Shiloh. He was buried. He was dug up, taken to Tennessee, Savannah, Tennessee, where he was reburied, dug up, brought to Manitowoc, where he was buried, dug up, and then taken to New York for his final. So we certainly hope that George has finally found his final resting place, and we now know where's Waldo. Any questions anybody have any questions that I can answer?
Those first couple burials and everything, he couldn't have been very good looking in that glass.
I can't imagine that he would have been by that time, although he was.
Bombed him yet? Brought him back?
Yeah, they embalmed him about 10 days after his death and brought him back. So that I imagine that helped a little bit. But yeah, 10 days, you're not the freshest anymore.
Did you say he was married and his wife remained in Manitowoc?
His brother and his brother's wife. That was Will. He was not married. He was single at the time of his death. No, he never married. He was, like I say, he was an attorney. That he had only been here from 1858 to 1862 before he became captain of 14th Wisconsin.
Why was there a Waldo section of the cemetery then if he was?
Well, it's Wood Waldo. His brother married a Wood, and well, because I don't know, maybe they didn't want to admit that George wasn't there anymore, so they put Wood Waldo on it. Because I can't think of any other Waldos that were buried there. You're right. Yeah.
Well, her name was Waldo after she got married. First it was Wood, and then her name was Waldo.
True. Yeah, that's true. She would have been a Waldo. Dave.
Waldo, which Waldo is Waldo Boulevard named?
We think George. We think it's George.
Okay.
Although we've looked, but we can't find anything in the city records to indicate. But we think it was George because he was a hero of Manitowoc. Don?
Yeah, for the first question, I read about those caskets. They would pack the body in rock salt,
Okay.
you know.
If they could, I would assume if they didn't embalm him.
Yeah, I read where it was rock salt.
Sure, that would make sense.
Body.
Yeah. Dave?
Tombstone, headstone here, is this your picture or off the?
That's off the internet.
Okay.
That's the one that I almost dropped my teeth on when I saw that.
Second question, you showed the steamboat Sultana taking them to Shiloh. Is that the one that blew up with
That was handy. Although it could be because that didn't sink until 65, or didn't burn until 65. You know, it burned that right after the war was over. So it could have been Sultana. It's hard to say.
well, the name Sultana was on it.
Yeah. I don't know if that was the one that they would have traveled on down to Shiloh. But, so I.
That was the one that exploded with all the.
The boiler exploded and killed about 1,500 Union soldiers.
That Sultana was on a return trip bringing the wounded home,
Correct. Yep.
and they didn't make it.
Right. Yep. Any other questions, Amy?
I have one more. Do you know the name of the man from Kewaunee County who had the 30 recruits that?
I have his name. I have a couple of regimental rosters that his name would be listed. I just didn't take the time to look it up. But he is listed in as second lieutenant of the company of the 14th Wisconsin.
Okay.
So he easy to find if you got an internet. Just call the roster up. Dave?
Denny, was the Episcopal Church at that time the one that is here still today?
No, that was located on northeast corner of 9th and Chicago at that time. There was the church, and then when they built the new Episcopal church, I think that became a funeral home. That it remained a funeral home for many years, and then a second-hand store, and then finally torn down. Yeah.
Penny, do you know about what year Waldo Boulevard was dedicated?
I have no clue. We couldn't find any records on that as to when, who it was named for or when it was dedicated as that. No, there's just nothing in the city records.
What city did you say that this, he is buried now in New York?
What city?
Yeah, or what
What do I have there?
part of New York is that?
Prattsburg, Steuben County, New York.
You don't know where that is?
I have no idea. It's not near New York, I don't believe. It's out in the, outside of there somewhere. But that's where the Waldo family was originally from. Anything else? Thank you.